Let's continue with our discussion of the centrality of the gospel by Timothy Keller. And in this next portion, I think this is some of the most penetrating, like heart-cutting truths. And I really ask you especially to pay attention to what Tim Keller is talking about, pride and righteousness. Pride, how we approach our pride, how we have pride in our righteousness is a tremendous key to what keeps people from seeing God, both Christians, oftentimes Christians, and certainly non-Christians, why they don't really truly see God or get the gospel. So let's go there. Here we go. The Centrality of the Gospel by Timothy Keller. And this is the portion that says, what do both religious and irreligious people have in common? Remember, there's two common pathways to not get the gospel. That is hedonism, relativism, irreligiosity, or religiosity, legalism, moralism, right? But this is really, really insightful. How do both these kinds of people who seem very different, they seem so different, but from the viewpoint of the gospel, they're really the same. How, right? There are both ways to avoid Jesus as Savior and keep control of their lives. How? Irreligious people seek to be their own saviors and lords through worldly pride. So there's something of the world by which says, no one tells me how to live or what to do. I determine what is right and wrong for me. There's this inflated view of themselves and how they're in control and how they have a righteousness and of a worthiness in themselves. And this is their pride, which is built on something in the world, right? But moral and religious people seek to be their own saviors and lords through their religious pride. I'm more moral and spiritual than other people. So God owes it to me to listen to my prayers and take me to heaven. God cannot let just anything happen to me. He owes me a happy life. I've earned it. So it isn't exactly the way everybody says it today, but there's this general attitude that I've been a good person. So today you see it in so many, both in religious people and in religious people, that if something bad happens to their life, that if they think they've been a good person, that God must not love me if he lets this suffering happen to me, right? Why did I get cancer? How come I haven't, met somebody and had a good marriage yet? How come my child is sick? How come, how come my job didn't work out? I work really, really hard for these things. And yet in some way they think, and both today we see it in both ways, both the religious people and the religious people, they both come to this view because something inside of themselves, regardless of what they have a sense of pride. There's this estimation of their worthiness and of their righteousness, and God owes, right? And so today, if there's even some kind of like suffering or something doesn't work out in your life, well, almost always, if there's an anger or especially a resentment against God, dig down. There's usually something like this. So the irreligious person rejects Jesus entirely, of course. The religious person uses Jesus as an example and helper and teacher, but not a savior. So this is why, for instance, as long as Jesus is helpful to you, there's a lot of Christians out there that love saying Jesus is my savior, but really they're not. It's a lip service that, Jesus is a good example. He teaches. So this is why a lot of liberal versions of Christianity, as long as Jesus is only your example, or in like prosperity theology, Jesus is going to help us. He's going to help me get a better life, my best life now, as a famous preacher likes to preach. And Jesus is your helper. And maybe he's going to even be a teacher, like they're perfectly fine having Jesus being our teacher. But one of the things that people cannot accept is that we're utterly incapable because we're so wretched that Jesus fully has to save us and lay down his life for us. And this is the only way. In fact, it's really, really offensive that if the only way to get to God is that Jesus has to utterly lay down his life and somehow you have to believe in this atoning work, and receive salvation wholly by grace, by nothing that you can, contribute of your own righteousness or your worth. This is really, really offensive to tons of people, of course, of other religions, but quite frankly, a lot of Christians, even if they sometimes can say, I can accept that doctrine, somewhere deep in their heart, they haven't really quite swallowed it yet, right? So in her novel, Wise Blood, Flannery O'Connor's main character, Hazel, thinks that the way to avoid Jesus is to avoid sin. In other words, as long as you still don't have anything obviously bad in your life, like I have enough self-discipline and enough moral goodness in me that I don't have sin. I'm not obviously sinning. And so I'm not obviously sinning. So, of course, a lot of non-Christians, they don't find the whole message of the gospel to be good news because they're not obviously sinning. They're not bad. They're not bad enough to need Jesus. But there's lots of actually religious people, including Christians who they're fine. They're like, they have this notional understanding of Jesus as their savior, but they don't have a deep love for Jesus. They don't have this kind of electrified joy and deep, tremendous gratitude for Jesus because they're still, they can kind of keep their act together. They're avoiding sin. This is what he means. This is what Flannery O'Connor means. This is what Tim Keller is getting at. So these are two different ways to do the same thing, but just control your own life. So ironically, moralists, despite all the emphasis on traditional standards, are in the end self-centered and individualistic because they have set themselves up as their own savior. They have their own law, they have their own righteousness, and of course, they don't want anybody else's law. They don't need God. So they're their own Lord and their own Savior. And of course, relatives, because everybody, it's relative. Everybody else can make up their own laws. And as long as they can be in control of it, they're a good person, right? But relativists, despite all their emphasis on freedom and acceptance, are in the end moralistic because they still have to live up to their own standard or become desperate. And often they take great pride in their own open-mindedness and judge others who are not. And today there's lots of irreligious people. They have their own standard and they are using it now to judge other people. In fact, to think that we can cancel them, that they're beneath respect. We certainly can't tolerate their, we can't let them have their own free view because their views are so bad that they have to be shut out. They must be condemned. And so let's go to this next portion. The irreligious person loses sight of the law and holiness of God, and the religious person loses sight of the love and grace of God. In the end, they both lose the gospel entirely. You really think that? So I want you to think about that. Someone who's really doesn't, a person who's a Christian, he believes in the gospel. He doesn't really, that's a strong statement to say that he loses the gospel entirely. I want you to just think about this. For the gospel is that on the cross, Jesus fulfilled the law of God out of love for us. Without a full understanding of the work of Christ, the reality of God's holiness will make his grace unreal. Or the reality of God's love will make his holiness unreal. I want to just stop there for a second. If you've been following any of our other videos, I have a video that I've trained our core folks at Revive to say that really the love of God and the holiness of God are basically the same thing. That if you don't get the holiness of God, you don't really truly get the love of God. And if you try to look for a love, which is just merely sentimental emotive without holiness, that you don't actually have real love either. The true love of God is holy, and the true holiness of God, its center, is love. It's not just moral standards, it's relational, tremendously sacrificial for the other person to help make them pure and beautiful and wonderful. Because you're like, I love you, and all, I'm perfectly fine with you being dirty and self-righteous and lying and corrupting and abusing other people. No. True love seeks the holiness of the other. True love seeks it purely. True love seeks pure goodness for the other and seeks the pure goodness of the other. So holiness and love are really one and the same. And if you want to really know a true view of God, he's truly holy and truly loving, and that's one and the same. Thus, here we go. If you don't get the holiness of God, you don't get God. And if you don't get the love of God, you don't get. And so now let's get back. So in the end, they both lose the gospel entirely. You don't actually get God. The point of the gospel is to get God. Who is God? What has he done for you to reveal who he truly is for us? That he's always so for us. So only the gospel that we are so sinful that we need to be saved utterly by grace allows us to see God as he really is in his holiness and his love. The gospel shows us a God far more holy than the legalist can bear. He had to die because we could not satisfy his holy demands. And yet far more, not just his demands, but his holy character. And yet far more merciful than a humanist can conceive, he had to die because he loved us. And I'll just stop, get to the conclusion of this particular video by saying something about this. I want to just close by just a reflection. I've read this paper again and again, and I don't think I fully got this the first time or the second time. It was like the light came into my life and it was dim. And I had to read this multiple times and chew on this multiple times and pray on this multiple times. But the thing I really wanted, I first started to get something like this when I actually read C.S. Lewis. In his book, Mere Christianity, he has a chapter on pride. And he says, pride is the greatest sin. It's the greatest. It's not murder. It's not lying. It's not sexual, it's not sexual lust or adultery. It's not even love of money. It's pride. And pride is so invisible. It's like this tasteless, odorless, invisible poison that's in the heart and mind of everyone. And you know where it reflects itself? In our righteousness, in our estimation of how good we think we are. So whether you are an irreligious person, the secular, relativistic, humanistic person, or you are a religious person, or you're a very moral person, really, as long as you think you're good in that way, your righteousness is how I'm a good person. That's how you get enough superiority inside of you. You don't actually think you need a salvation wholly by grace. That the Son of God had to die and receive the wrath of God in your place. But the first time I actually really started to realize that exactly in the place where I think I'm good is where I'm so filled with my pride, and that I'm doing this all the time and I actually can't stop. That my pride is a sin inside of me that's really this ugly sin. And so it's a sin underneath my righteousness. It's a sin underneath my sin. No, it's actually the sin underneath my righteousness, my estimation of my worthiness, the thing that makes me think I'm better than other people. And as soon as I began to realize that is what makes me such a rotten person, and that's why I get so defensive, or I get offended if somebody else says, "Hey, you're not good about this, SooSang. You're bad, SooSang. You're dumb. You're not this or that." That's what made me get offended, and it's also what made me get insecure and have to prove I'm good enough. I'm prove my worthiness. I'm prove my righteousness, and that's this thing inside of my that I'm always wrestling with inferiority, superiority, and I'm always got to prove my superior. I've got to justify myself in other language, or in other words, I've got to pump up my pride. But I always just think I'm just doing righteousness. But really, it's just another way I don't actually need Jesus. I don't need the full totality of his grace, the full totality and sufficiency of his atoning work for me. I don't need his spirit enter into me to heal me of this righteousness that inside of my righteousness, if I do something that's righteous, it's actually righteous, but right underneath that is my pride, which is actually really quite horribly damnable. When I actually finally started to realize that, that's when I truly started to get my deep, deep need for Jesus. And that's where so many people are. Once you finally start to get to that place, then Jesus will become so tremendously glorious that God would love such a rotten, horrible, self-righteous prig, boastful Pharisee like me. Once you get to that place, the gospel becomes just it becomes electrifying. And it begins to give you a new foundation, a new humility, because yourself is not resting on yourself. It's yourself is not resting on anything of your own achievements, of your own attainments. Yourself doesn't have to be built on pride or your own righteousness. You can admit what's wrong with you. You can say, I'm good in this way, but it doesn't puff you up because I am good in this way, but that guy's better than me. That's cool. And you can actually be glad that other people are better than you in all kinds of ways. And you can be compassionate to other people who are worse than you in other ways without being better than them, only because Jesus can truly free you. And this is the unbelievable power of the gospel. And so if you're watching this, I hope you could discover this. And if you don't yet know it, pray hard to know it. And keep listening and swallowing the gospel like Martin Luther said, and beat it into your head continually. And think about your pride and your righteousness, your worthiness. That'll be a key.